Jack was such a beautiful boy. He was quiet, sensitive. He was so caring. Paul, he was full of energy, lots of friends, very mischievous, but he absolutely adored his big brother.
Claire Throssel's two young sons were killed by their father during a contact visit ordered by the family courts. He lured them into his house with the promise of a new train set, then barricaded them into the attic, setting 14 separate fires. He was killed. 9-year-old Paul died of his injuries soon after, and 12-year-old Jack, who had tried to save his brother, died 5 days later in hospital.
When the fireman had picked him up, he said to the fireman, "My dad did this and he did it on purpose." And even though he was dying, he did his best to tell as many people as he could what had happened. And that was the only time in the whole court process that Jack's voice was heard. He'd never been asked his feelings, what he wanted, how he felt.
Claire had left the boy's father after years of violence and abuse. He'd fought her for contact, a battle that ended in the family courts.
You made it quite clear that their father had been violent towards you, that the boys were afraid of him, that they didn't want contact with him, but the court gave him contact anyway.
Yes, I'd written in my court application that he was capable of killing the boys. He had already been violent to me. He'd been abusive to the boys. I knew the boys weren't safe with him. They knew they weren't safe with him.
And allowed contact that in the end cost you the lives of your two sons.
Absolutely.
New research released by the charity Women's Aid today reveals that in the decade since Jack and Paul were killed, 19 other children have died at the hands of a parent who was a perpetrator of domestic abuse. The youngest was just 3 weeks old, the oldest 11. 17 of the 18 perpetrators were men.
Women's Aid have been tracking child homicides linked to unsafe contact for 30 years. They say in that time, 67 children have been killed by an abusive parent. That's the equivalent of more than 2 classrooms full of children. All deaths, the charity insists, which could have been avoided.
A critical issue is the so-called presumption of contact. While not all contact arrangements are formalised through the family court, when they are, the legal starting point is that it is in the child's best interests to continue contact with both parents.
This presumption of contact, the idea that whatever has happened, there should still be contact, why does that need to end?
The overriding principle is parental contact at all costs. You can be a perpetrator of domestic abuse, you can have harmed your partner in all manner of ways, but there is a strange presumption that somehow you can still be a good parent, you can still be a good dad. That needs to be got rid of.
Because it's costing children's lives.
It's costing children's lives.
The Ministry of Justice told us today their sincere condolences go out to all the families in this report. We will carefully consider its findings and see where improvements can be made to the family court system to help prevent these awful crimes. One case that came too late to figure in today's grim numbers of children killed is that of Sarah Sharif. The 10-year-old was murdered by her father Irfan and stepmother Bainash Patul. Her father was given custody of her, despite years of reported abuse of her mother and her siblings. As Claire held her dying boy, she vowed no other children would die at the hands of an abusive parent. It's a promise she hasn't yet been able to keep, but she won't stop trying.
At night time, I used to always pop my head around before I went to bed and watch them sleeping. Now I go to where they sleep and I cry, but I have to keep trying to make this difference because this cannot carry on.
You mentioned Claire Throssel there. You know the case of Claire Throssel very well. As her boys were dying, she said she vowed they would be the last children to die in those circumstances. She hasn't been able to keep that promise. The new report today, another 19 child homicides in 9 years. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's absolutely tragic that we know that there has been that level of deaths just in the 9 years between 2015 and 2024. And it's not just that. We know of 60% of the 40,000 cases that came through Cafcass had incidents of domestic abuse where one of the parents was a known domestic abuser. And as Claire will tell you, it goes well beyond the impact in terms of child deaths. It's broader experiences, sadly, of children facing domestic abuse by a parent where there's been court-ordered contact.
So this presumption of contact in the family courts, I mean, it's only supposed to operate unless there are compelling reasons to the contrary. Now, surely a history of domestic abuse should be considered under the current legislation as a compelling reason to the contrary, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. It came in as part of the Children's Act in 2014, and the presumption means that it assumes that both parents should be involved in the child's life. But a culture has grown up through the family courts, which means that's also happening in cases where there is known domestic abuse. And so the children's interests are not being put first. And that's led to those 19 tragedies we've heard about in the review that came out today, as well as the findings of the harm report back in 2020, which found that actually this was a culture that was growing and had to be stopped. And they recommended that the presumption was looked at all those years ago. It's coming up to the 5th anniversary this year, and so urgent action really is needed.
I mean, you talk about urgent action, and you rightly talk about the harm panel and the report that came out of it 5 years ago. That raised really serious concerns about, among other things, the presumption of contact. Why hasn't it changed since then? The details of the review haven't even been published.
Well, it's shocking that nothing occurred under the last government, and I know, having worked very closely with ministers and other colleagues in our own government, that they are underway with a review and putting together some recommendations. I promised Claire if I got elected that I would take this up, and I'm determined to work with her and other colleagues across the House to change the law so we change this horrific situation where we see these tragedies decade after decade. Because those 19 children in the report published today by Women's Aid are on top of the 48 children we know were killed at the hands of known domestic abusers on a permitted contact visit during the previous 2 decades. So the numbers are ratcheting up. It is time for action. One of the most tragic things for me in a town like mine, where Claire and her boys were so well known, the 2 boys went to the school that I went to when I was growing up here, is knowing the talent that those 2 young boys had and what their potential could have been had their case been dealt with properly by Cafcass and by the family courts.
And just very briefly, if you would, I mean, you talk about the need for urgency and you say that this government is looking at it. Are you confident that this presumption of contact will be taken out of the law?
So I know that this government wants to halve domestic abuse in this parliament, and that's the right thing to do. And I've said a number of times in the chamber that we need to be using everything in our toolkit to do that. The cases are very complex. I know they've got to the end of reviewing the cases and are taking the time to carefully put together the recommendations, because those recommendations need to work and they need to work in practice. And it's right that that's done properly, because it is a complex system and the family courts do need considerable reform. So I will carry on working with them, as I know Claire will, to get the outcome that families and particular children desperately need.
Because lives are at stake.
They are, yeah, and we've seen that. We've seen that, and on a scale that is unacceptable at present.
Dr. Marie Tidball, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.